Hello, my name is Dustin. From 2016 to 2023, I was the props second and eventually the props marshal. During that time period, I painted numerous weapons, and in this video series, I want to share with you some simple techniques that I use over and over to paint good-looking weapons. I want to start with talking about common mistakes people make. First seems obvious, but happens more often than not, and that's improper prep of your weapon. It needs to be clean, it needs to be sanded, and then probably cleaned again. We'll cover this a little bit later in the video, but if it's not properly cleaned, the Plastidip won't properly adhere, and that's when you see blades shed like a snake. The second is when your paint cracks. This can happen for a couple different reasons. The first being that you used a spray paint instead of an acrylic paint. The spray paint doesn't have enough latex in it, and it doesn't flex with the weapon. Now, if it cracks and you're using an acrylic paint, one, that can just happen over time. That just tends to happen. Two, it's when there's too much paint applied to the weapon, as if the whole blade was covered with the acrylic paint versus just being a little bit on there. You'll see the way I paint weapons, I tend to only use a little bit of acrylic paint, and the base of the weapon is going to be all Plastidip, and I use the color of Plastidip, the same color of the weapon. For example, if I make a thermium weapon, I'm using a red Plastidip. The third mistake that is very common is when your clear coat flakes or cracks. That can happen for a couple different reasons. The most common reason, I believe, is if the wrong clear coat is used and it's either not flexible enough, there's too much clear coat on there, or things with a higher gloss tend to be tackier and don't seem to last as long. The third thing I want to talk about is color choices. If you look at the rules, it'll say goblin iron needs to be green, or thermium needs to be red. You'll see when I paint weapons, I tend to use coppers and bronzes to complement those colors while keeping the overall look of the weapon. If you paint it just that one solid color, as in green for goblin iron, it fits within the rules, but it tends to look a little plain. I add those other colors to kind of elevate the look. Let's get started. This is a technique to get a darker red Plastidip. I've painted a red spot in the back of the cardboard just for comparison. That is just straight red Plastidip, and we'll be able to compare how this comes out to that. So to do this, we need black Plastidip and we need red Plastidip. What we're going to do is I have the sword already painted black to start with, and then we're going to do a thin layer of black Plastidip over that. So that is what we're doing first here. Now, while that's still wet, we're going to use red Plastidip right on top of it. We're going to let that dry. That's all we have to do to get the look we're going for here. When you do this, it won't look, right now it doesn't look like it's going to blend very well. When it levels out, when it finishes, it blends. Just a quick comparison to show the differences between the dark red and the regular red Plastidip. I call this technique the sponge technique, and I use a regular kitchen sponge that I just cut a small piece off, and I use it completely dry. I cover the entire bottom with paint, and I get it pretty dry to do this. All I do is dab it across the sword, adding more paint as I go. If it gets thick in spots, I just dab over the same spot a couple times and thin it back out. But this is the general look I'm going for when I reference the sponge technique. For the grind mark technique, I use a 3M moderate stripping pad, and I put a little bit of paint on there. I don't put too much on there. I start from the middle of the blade and I pull downwards and try to simulate some grind marks on the sword. I do that across the entire blade. Here's a brief comparison of the two techniques we just did. This is the grind mark technique. This is the kind of look you're going for with that. If I flip the blade over, here is the sponge technique once again. A lot more coverage, but you can clearly see both colors still. This is a third technique I use in the videos. I don't really have a name for this one. A lot of times I mention that I'm doing it, sometimes I fail at doing that. But what I'm going to do is use that same 3M moderate stripping pad that I used for the grind marks, and all I'm going to do is dab on top of the sword that I'm doing. Now on the sponge technique, if I'm using the same color, as you can see, nothing's really showing up. There is paint going down, but it's not showing up. I'll show you why in a brief moment. Now, if I use that same technique on the grind mark, you can see that it's adding just a little bit more flavor to the blade. I tend to only do this really in the center where there's complete black or complete one color of the base color, but you can see what that added depth-wise to it. Now, going back to the sponge technique. When I use this on sponge technique, I tend to add a little bit of a different color just to add a little depth to it. And in this case, I'm just going to add blue just because it'll stand out pretty good. So just a little bit of blue on there. I'm going to do that same kind of just a little light dab on there. I know in the video right now you can't really see it. When I pull it up closer, I'm hoping you're going to be able to. So you can see it added a bit more to it as opposed to down here where I didn't do it. Just kind of plain. Adds just a little bit more color to it.